let's get going. I guess what I mostly want to talk about, and then I'll get around to the business of the guidelines towards the end of what I've prepared for you. Is this changing? Let's see. No. There we go. I want to challenge you when I talk about the challenge for small-scale fisheries. I think the big challenge is the ongoing push for privatization. You're going to hear more later this week about ocean grabbing in the larger sense. I'm just going to focus today on fishery privatization. And this has been going on now for some time. So here you see, on those of you that can see the screen, and I apologize if you can't, there's a cover of a book up called The Privatization of the Oceans. What I'm showing you now is just a headline from the New York Times, probably the most influential paper in the United States, where they're quoting our head government minister for fisheries a few years back saying that the government was going to start taking preliminary steps towards privatizing fisheries in New England. So it's not like this is some sort of allegation or sort of imagining on my part. This is the way people are openly talking right now around the globe. A few years back, there was a major paper published in the journal Science, and here on the screen now is how the journal of Science has its own sort of PR section, and they announced this article with this headline: "Privatization prevents collapse of fish stocks." The New York Times, again, their version of this paper, "Privately owned fisheries may help shore up stocks," and then my sort of favorite maybe in quotation marks, the British magazine/newspaper, The Economist. Their headline was, "Scientists find proof that privatizing fisheries will save stocks." And combined with these kinds of sort of grandiose claims, you also see what I think is just an outright scare tactic. So here's a publication by two fisheries economists in the US. One last chance. There's only one last chance to save the fisheries in New England, and that's to privatize. So I have come to sort of start calling this the privatizer perish approach, where you're actually scaring people. You've only got one last hope to save your fisheries, and that's to privatize. I think it's important to have a little bit of an understanding how we got here. And this is very much rooted in the history of a single academic discipline, fisheries economics. Here's a quote from a very famous Canadian fisheries economist, Parzival Copes, where he was reflecting back towards the end of his career, and he said, "From the start," now the start in this quote is 1954. "From the start, it was recognized that fishery problems were related to the absence of individual property rights in the fish stocks." That's the problem diagnosis in a nutshell. And there's a logic here, and I think you have to understand this logic, and that is that fishery economists look around at the oceans and they have an underlying belief that private property creates the incentive for wise resource management. That's where they start. Now that's a belief. Then they notice something which we could call a fact, at least what they perceive to be a fact, that there are no private property rights in fisheries, and fisheries management is a mess. Therefore, the situation requires private property. Now that's my wording, but here's a direct quote from one of the premier fisheries economists today, also an advisor to the Icelandic government, and also, if you pay attention a little later in my talk, he's one of the scientific advisors to the GPO, which is a new initiative from the World Bank called the Global Partnership for Oceans. And he says that fisheries suffer from this lack of property rights, or they're poor or they're non-existent, and this generally results in huge inefficiencies frequently referred to as the fisheries problem. That's the fisheries problem, not about your concerns about human rights and equity and gender. The problem is there's no property rights. So if that's your belief system, well, then the remedy is fairly certain. It follows immediately that the fisheries problem would disappear if only the appropriate property rights could be defined, imposed, and enforced. So that's where fisheries economics started in 1954, and that's where it's been stuck ever since. The quest for them is, how do you introduce property rights in fisheries? And the answer was licenses. Oh, wait, that didn't work. The answer is now ITQs, which I'm sure some of you in the audience know, individual transferable quotas. But what are ITQs? And here's where it's sort of alphabet soup and the vocabulary keeps changing. You'll see terms like rights-based fishing, individual transferable quotas, and the EU invented a new term a year ago when they had their proposed reform to the common fisheries policy. They started calling these things transferable fishing concessions. Now, the term that's probably the most widely used is rights-based fishing. All of them amount to the same thing. They're going to try and privatize fishery access so that they can solve the fisheries problem. The real problem here is that there's a failure to distinguish what is a tool from an ideology. And the tool is simply pre-assigning catch. That's what happens under these systems. So instead of going out under open competition and you catch more than me, your catch is pre-assigned. And in some cases, in some fisheries, in some parts of the world, that has benefits. But that's just a tool. The ideology is one that insists that the tool only works and does work and has to be because it's private property. So they've gone from a tool to an ideology. And when you make the mistake or confuse the ideology for the tool, that's when you get to what I call the privatization model. And the privatization model, I know many of you, you've got examples of it here. You had to fight pretty hard to change one program that I know. The privatization model has characteristic features the world over, all right? And these features are pre-assigned catch, that is, given freely to select vessel owners, based on catch history, it's indefinite, it's transferable, which means it acquires a monetary value, and it's wrapped in a rhetoric of deregulation and property rights, and is predicated upon the embrace of trickle-down theories of economic growth. All of this is a familiar package around the world. And it's reached the state now where the privatization model is the solution on offer all around the world. Now let's go to this term rights-based fishing, because this is one of the places where I think you have to understand what is meant by that. This is a book that was published in 1988 reflecting a conference, an international conference in Iceland in 1985. The title of the book is the title of the conference, Rights-Based Fishing. And here in the introduction, I don't think you could ask for a clearer statement of what this is all about. So again, these are their words, not mine. ITQs are part of one of the great institutional changes of our times, the enclosure and privatization of the common resources of the ocean. These are now mostly the exclusive property of the coastal states of the world. So much for this being about missing property rights. This is an overthrow. This is a revolution. There are already property rights. They admit it. The coastal states of the world own these resources. So you have to understand what the stakes are here. Now, back to the famous article from 2008. Here's another scholar, this is a Canadian, Boris Worm. The reaction that single paper received, it was almost hallelujah. There are fisheries which are doing well because of rights-based management. It's the silver lining that we have been looking for. Now we need to implement these solutions more widely. I think you need to understand the key explanatory logic, how the proponents think this system works. Remember, I say it's just because catch is pre-assigned, but they say that there's some magic that comes from ownership. So here's the famous paper by 3 University of California, Santa Barbara authors. And the lead author was quoted when this paper was released in the popular press as explaining it this way. The difference is comparable to renting an apartment versus the house you own. If you own something, you take care of it. You protect your investment. But there's no incentive for stewardship when you don't own the rights to it. And then in a companion paper in the British journal Nature at the same time period in 2008, 2 additional fishery economists, in this slide here, you won't be able to see it, but I'll read just the middle part. They're explaining again how these privatization systems work. And they say, Shares in a collapsed fishery are worth as little as shares in a collapsed bank. So they're making a direct comparison between fisheries and banking, and if only you own it, you take care of it. Now the irony here is that this was 2008 in the early fall, and we all know what happened to the world economy a little later that year. So I sort of joke sometimes, oh, this theory is good for fish but bad for banks. And the theory here is, if you own something, you'll take care of it, or, again, what I like to call the ownership promotes stewardship thesis. It's a theory of self-interest. All right. That's enough of sort of a background primer, sort of how we got here. But where are we now? And I mean, when I show you those papers, that's 2008, so some, time has moved on. Where are we now? Well, here, the wonderful thing about the internet is you can find out a lot with not much work. So combing through some funding foundations, mostly located in the US, you find quite revealing statements. So here's one from an outfit called the Oak Foundation. I think this is their 2014, maybe their 2013 grant report. They're going to give $600,000 to Environmental Defense Fund, which is an environmental NGO in the US, and you will see Environmental Defense Fund again in a moment. $600,000. Now, what's the purpose of this? It's to implement key reforms in Belize. Okay? In Belize's fisheries sector, in an effort to reduce and eventually end the overfishing of key marine species. The EDF will work to create a permanent, irrevocable policy. Now, you might wonder, how is it possible to use the word permanent and irrevocable in the same sentence as the word policy? All right? But here it is. They put this stuff out there. Let's go back. It's a permanent and irreversible policy and a regulatory environment for a rights-based fishery management tool. Now remember what rights-based fishing means. It means privatization. The government, with EDF, will roll out managed access to the entire marine ecosystem of Belize by 2016 in partnership with a coalition of non-governmental organizations and fishermen. Here's another initiative. Now look at some of the logos that are on this one. You've got FAO, or as we say FAO. You've got the World Bank. You've got the United Nations Environment Program. And I can't read the other. I think the other one is this 2050 or 50 and 10. The Global Sustainable Fisheries Management and Biodiversity Conservation in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. So this is beyond the 200-mile limits, right? And now people are getting concerned about, well, what happens if we maybe move out there and overfish those? So what's the recommendation from this group? Moving towards the ecosystem approach and rights-based systems. So now we're not only talking about privatizing the EEZs, we're talking about privatizing everything. Here's another new document. This one is just out this spring. The title is Towards Investment in Sustainable Fisheries. And it is put out by Environmental Defense Fund, a unit of the Prince Charles Charitable Trust, and this 50 in 10 outfit. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that effort in a moment. Also new out this year is this document. This is the framework document for the Global Partnership for Oceans, which I mentioned previously. That was initiated by the World Bank and has been undergoing some sort of revisions. I'll speak a little bit about details of the Global Partnership for Oceans. A lot of people want to help save the oceans. All right, what is Prince Charles and EDF up to? Towards investment in sustainable fisheries. Well, this one you don't have to dig too hard. Let's look at the title of Chapter 1. Introducing Fisheries as Investable Propositions. Does this sound like the kind of conversation you have when you're talking about managing your fisheries? Right? No. I mean, fisheries as investable propositions? what are they talking about? And here in chapter 1, the investment case. And the paragraph right under that, the line that just stands out is, in other words, there's a real return on investment to be had. Okay, I'll come back to this group in a little bit, but it's clear if you read this document that they are talking about a radical transformation of how most of us think about fisheries. When we think about investment, we think about boat owners perhaps putting a new winch on or getting a new boat. This is all about attracting private capital. And they talk at length in this document about, in order to make the transition to a new sustainable future for fisheries, we're going to need investment capital. And they say that historically, investment comes from the public sector. Well, I mean, I think they're right in that respect. If you think about fisheries as a public good, it's not really any different than roads and schools, right? Where does the investment for that come from? It comes out of the public coffers because it's thought to be a benefit to the entire public. So if fisheries need investment to become more sustainably managed, you might think that people would argue, well, how do we get the central government some more money to put into fisheries? That's not what these folks are after. These folks are after something they call triple P, which is public-private partnerships. And they need private capital now to start investing, not as charity, but as investment. So this is really fisheries now on Wall Street. And somehow, and I'm not, somehow taking fisheries to Wall Street is going to be good for poor people. That's the premise. They couch all this as they're not really doing it so Wall Street can make money. They're doing it to fight poverty and help poor people. Okay. The other thing that I showed you was that Global Partnership for Oceans initiative. Now, what is that? And that's gone through some interesting evolution, and I think the only fair way to talk about it is make a distinction between where they started and where they are now. So I'm calling where they started version 1.0, because they initially announced this at an international conference hosted by The Economist magazine. They talked about how many billions they had to invest in this thing, and then they start setting it up. And they had a first draft of the framework document. Now, I won't read the whole thing here, but you can see they start by acknowledging that historically, at least in their eyes, oceans were access open to all users. Essentially, the oceans are the planet's largest commons. All right, let's stop there, because one of the things I want you to sort of see is how confused these people are. Is it open access or is it common property? Now, open access in legal terms means no property, not the open entry that you sometimes see in fishery regimes, right? So when people like this talk about open access, they should be meaning no property. But in the same paragraph, oh, it's a commons. Well, those aren't the same. And then they go on to say what happens is the well-documented tragedy of the commons. Okay, I'll have a little more to say about the so-called tragedy of the commons as I go along, but I just want you to see the sort of founding rationale for the Global Partnership for Oceans. Oh, we've got this tragedy of the commons, and we need to address that, and the fundamental thing is that governments keep fooling around, the last sentence, with approaches that did not address the conditions of open access. So there's the real problem. And then in this same document, which is replete with all kinds of references to how rights-based fishing, and remember that means privatization, is going to solve all this. And to buttress these arguments, there are statements like this where they showcase the well-known cases of rights-based fisheries management reform in Iceland, Namibia, New Zealand, Norway, and the US have shown that sizable economic, social, and environmental benefits over the last decade. I want to call attention to their saying that there's social benefits. Okay. I think you need to take stock. I think you have to sort of pause. I'll come back to a recommendation at the end that you need to study up, because you need to understand what's happening in the world with regard to people talking about rights. You're talking about rights, you're singing about rights, they're talking about rights. I don't think you guys are on the same page. I know you're not on the same page. They've got the World Bank, they've got the Global Partnership for Oceans, they've got the Global Environmental Facility. I didn't mention that. What's that? That's another place where nations of the world are going to deposit money to save oceans and poor people. But who's going to administer that money? The World Bank. All right, so all roads in some sense lead back to the World Bank. And then in parentheses I added, they've also got, they being the privatizers, they've also got Walton. Well, that's the Walton Family Fund in the United States. That's a philanthropic foundation associated with Walmart. They've got the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. That's the philanthropic foundation associated with the money from Intel, the chip maker, Gordon Moore. And, well, they've got billions. What do you have? Right? What do you have? You got people, and you got the guidelines. All right? I'm not sure that's enough, but let's carry on here, because this is interesting. They have noticed, they being the privatizers, they've noticed that you've got the guidelines. So, the GPO version 2.0, which is the final document that's out as of March, I think, of 2014. All the references, I think there's one remaining, that may be in their Blue Ribbon Advisory Committee, I think maybe all the references in the framework document itself to rights-based fishing are gone. And in their place, there's all kinds of language sprinkled throughout that document about human rights, the small-scale guidelines, the 10-year guidelines, gender. And, you know, I mean, that much you sort of have to admit. This has been a profound change in vocabulary. And let's look at Prince Charles and EDF, Chapter 2, the enablers of increased value. What's going to make all this possible? Remember, they're the ones that want to make fisheries investable opportunities, but got to give them credit. The enablers are, number one, secure tenure. They're talking about tenure. You're talking about tenure. They're talking about tenure. And this is where I came up with the title. But has the leopard changed its spots? How do you know if they are still talking about privatization when they have changed their words to your words? Okay? That's what's going on here, right? Now, you might, you know, I mean, this is sort of a two-sided little dilemma. On the one hand, congratulations, you've got them using your vocabulary. All right? Yeah. Well, I didn't want to come up here and not acknowledge any good news. All right, so you've got them using your vocabulary. But is it sincere, or is it what I call later on, and well, I'll mention it now, strategically benign rhetoric? That's a fancy term, right, for saying, well, you're going to use words that don't alarm anybody but carry on with your plans. Okay, so which is it, and how do you know? And I think what you need, I think you need a toolkit for detecting a privatization agenda. Okay? And I think one way to do this is just simply look a little bit deeper at the language. Do they talk about rights-based fishing? Do they talk about the tragedy of the commons? Do they talk about too many boats chasing too few fish? Okay? Do they talk about fisheries as investable opportunities? Do they talk about using market-based instruments to create incentives? Do they talk about creating incentives to promote stewardship? These are all phrases that are associated quite clearly with privatization. So if I go, the easy case is to look at the Prince Charles EDF document. They start out by saying, Implementing secure tenure provides fishers with a long-term vested interest in the health of the resource. It provides access and exclusivity to secure long-term returns, which are essential for increasing the value of fisheries. Tenure systems allocate a secure area or share of the catch to people who operate within the fishery. Secure tenure can be all right? And it goes on that this is important because it changes fishers' incentives. They're saying it's the security of tenure, not the fact that you changed whether it's an open competition for catch versus pre-assigning catch. It's all wrapped in this rhetoric of secure tenure provides incentives, and it's characterized as the tragedy of the commons. So this one I think is easy to decode. Well-implemented secure tenure rights, secure tenure requires conditions that are clearly defined and can only be revoked through a legitimate process. This gives the fishers the security to plan for the long term, and by extension gives investors the confidence to commit funds. Who's the security for again?
The investors.
The investors, okay? This is really about making fishing safe for investment. Having secure tenure is fundamental to reducing the risk of investment in fisheries. Now, notice again the sort of inversion here. For decades, we've been told the problem is overcapitalization. Now, suddenly, we need more capital and more investment. It's just different investment. It's not you guys with your boats, right? It's Wall Street. And if you're going to get Wall Street in the game, it's got to be secure. So I think this one's very easy to decode. Now, here it just becomes exposed. Secure tenure encompasses many systems of management and is often referred to as rights-based management. So now they're no longer hiding the vocabulary shift. But the GPO never committed slips like that. So here's, I said, what about the GPO version 2.0? Here's one of their statements. Reduce the open access nature of fisheries by creating responsible tenure arrangements, including secure access rights for fishers and the incentives for them to hold a stake in the health of the fisheries. So that one I say, well, that's pretty characteristic. The problem is that you got to create this incentive, and you do that through secure rights. On the other hand, look at this statement by the GPO, version 2.0. The GPO will work exclusively to empower local ocean users, the owners of this public resource, to take a long-term stake in the health of those resources and will help them to reap the benefits from them. Well, I mean, you could be a little cynical and say this is sort of a classic case of, you know, I'm here to help you. And you could quibble with their notion that it's only the users of the resource that own it, right? We usually think of these as broad, publicly owned resources. But I would sort of submit that that language might be viewed by many people as somewhat positive. They're going to work exclusively to help you. What to do? Right? What do you do? I mean, you are going to see, like, you know, the people in Belize, you're going to see buckets of money thrown at this. And language saying, I'm here to help you. And it's all about securing your tenure rights. So my advice is, number one, beware. And I think you've got three things to really be worried about. The first is strategically benign rhetoric. You're going to have to follow this stuff closely and relentlessly and dig through the documents to see if they're consistent in their language, or if on page 27 they revert back to saying it's about rights-based fishing. Two, I think you have to be careful about what I call beer and circus. And this is a reference to, at least supposedly, the way the Romans sustained the Roman Empire for so long was keep the populace distracted with beer and gladiator contests. And what it really means is keep your eye on the prize. And here, and I want to tread sort of very carefully, I think everybody in the room should be very proud of the guidelines. But I'm also quite certain that what was going on during the debate over the guidelines and will continue to go on during debate, discussion over implementation of the guidelines are very important parlor games that are outside the room, in the hallways, maybe in a hotel across the room from the hotel that you're doing your debates in. And without being too cynical, I think it's a very real possibility that in part, and it's only in part, you may be being distracted by the guidelines, while the privatizers are moving the real chess pieces around the board. And the third thing, and these are not mutually exclusive categories of things to be very, very wary of, is co-optation of your guidelines. So I've already sort of emphasized they're co-opting, that's again a fancy word for sort of stealing your words and principles. Be wary of them stealing your guidelines. And so you can see this. Everybody's in a rush now to invoke the guidelines. So here's the Prince Charles EDF report about, you know, turning fisheries into investable opportunities. But what do they say? They say there are other people that are working on guidelines for the establishment of secure tenure. The latter have been covered in some detail by FAO, which provided voluntary guidelines for the government of tenure, and then they talk about those, and they're then referencing the small-scale guidelines. So they've invoked both the tenure guidelines and the small-scale guidelines as if you're all one big happy family. And I don't think it takes much sort of parsing of these documents to see that there's a substantial difference between the way you folks talk about rights and the way they talk about rights. Whatever adjective you put in front of the word, right? It's as if, oh, we were talking about property rights and rights-based fishing. Let's talk about tenure-based fishing, but we mean what we always meant. And I just would encourage you to be very vigilant. The second sort of recommendation I would offer to you is something somebody told me a long time ago about situations like this. Indulge them. Okay? Indulge them. And what I mean by that is hold them accountable for their use of your words. So when the Global Partnership for Oceans invokes human rights, when they hold up examples that say, well, the programs that let me back up there. Ask them how their proposals are actually consistent with the words they have borrowed from you. Demand it. I think you need a specific accounting and say, oh, you're going to help us achieve equity, and you're going to help us achieve human rights, and you're going to help us achieve small-scale fishing community sustainability. Tell me exactly how. So, for example, when they parade the rights-based programs in Iceland and New Zealand and Denmark, ask them how those programs are consistent with your emphasis on equity, customary rights, human rights, and sustaining small-scale fishing communities. You know, for example, Iceland, right, had its entire program judged by the UN Committee on Human Rights to be a violation of the Covenant on Human Rights. I think it takes a lot of nerve to throw Iceland out as an example that's supposedly consistent with your goals. New Zealand, I was giving a talk relatively recently in Australia, but there were several New Zealanders there, including one person who is now an advisor to the World Bank and whose consultancy report to the World Bank is cited prominently in the EDF Prince Charles document. And this fellow took exception to my asking people, you know, in my view of sort of fishery management, a lot of modern fishery management really consists of stealing from the future. And we call that management, right? We're playing these games over who we're going to endow in the present generation with these allocations of rights. And the one sure loser is the next generation. And I've sort of said, if you want to test a program for sustainability, answer two questions. Tell me how you're going to decide when to stop fishing, and tell me how you're going to deal with new entry by the next generation. Just those two things, and I can tell if you have a sustainable program or not. So this guy from New Zealand, he got very upset at my sort of emphasizing this to the Australians, and he said, and I've written this down and, you know, gone over it with him in public to verify it. He fired back with, he said, look, in New Zealand, young people do not aspire to own quota. It's too expensive. Young people aspire to own boats so that they can catch the quota owned by the corporations, including Maori corporations. And I think, fair enough, he laid it right out there. It's a quite candid statement. I just ask people around the world, is that your vision for your fisheries? Is that your vision for the next generation of young people? If it's not, you guys aren't on the same page with these people. Denmark, that system is flaunted all the time. We were just talking last night. There's a famous video episode where the architect of the Danish program is smiling as he says into the camera, well, we got rid of a lot of small boats. We have bigger boats than ever before. He's actually talking about an increase in capital investment, and he's proud of it. And a shrinking of the fleet, which means a shrinking of the coastal communities, quite profound in the Danish case. And he's smiling all the time he says this and says, this was by design. Which brings up another really important point. This stuff is not accidental. It's intentional. It's by design. So I think, again, if people are going to potentially co-opt you, they're going to use your language, hold them to it. Hold them accountable. I don't think the guidelines per se are going to help you defeat the World Bank. But I think you can use the guidelines and you can use the fact that they're using the guidelines. And lastly, and this is the only way I can tie what I have to say into the songs I heard, pay attention. I think you really do need to take this challenge of privatization very seriously. And it's unfortunate. It's a lot to keep track of, and I know everybody in the fishing world, you got a lot of other things on your mind and a lot of other demands on your time, but there's simply no substitute for dividing up the labor and following this stuff, because it's going to roll over you if you don't. And you've got this document in all of your packets, and I would highly commend that to you as a place to start, at least. Finally, people are starting to dig a little bit and document what's going on. And it's not hard, it just takes time. But, you know, people have to reveal their agendas sooner or later with language. So I would just encourage you to look at that. And this week, when you're having your discussions, I guess the last challenge I'll leave you with is, how are you going to ensure that your interest and emphasis on rights is not completely stolen and confused with another group's emphasis on rights? I know you're not talking about the same thing, but unless you vigorously and continuously insist on a distinction, your message is going to get lost in a deliberate cloud of confusion. And I'll stop there.